Hey everybody and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to take the knowledge we learned from the previous lesson with CSS and we're going to apply that to your website. Now this isn't going to go over everything that's involved in CSS, but it's going to give you a good taste of what CSS is about and what it can do for you. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set up the folder and the file for the CSS, and then we're going to link it to our HTML document so that way when we apply CSS styles, they apply directly to your website and you can see them in real time. So let's go ahead and start that. There's two different ways you could add a folder and add a file to your project. And the CSS folder and the CSS file are going to sit within the project or the folder, the main folder that your HTML document's in because they need to link together. So the first way that I'm going to show you is right here in Visual Studio Code on the left-hand side. You can actually click anywhere inside this My First Web Page area, and you're going to see little symbols at the top. The first one is create new file, and the second one's create new folder. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder. So we're going to click on that, and then it's going to bring up a blank space to enter a folder name. So we're going to do CSS, all lowercase. Then we're going to hit enter, and that creates the folder. Now the second way we can do this is we're actually going to just open up our File Explorer and navigate to that folder, your project folder where your index.html file is located. And then within that, you can go ahead and right click, or there's also an option up here for new folder. But you just need to create a new folder, and then that way you can name it CSS, hit enter. Now, I already have a CSS folder in here, so it's not going to let me do it. But that's the other way you can do it. So you can either do it from your File Explorer or you can do it from within your Visual Studio Code. I like to do it from Visual Studio Code just because it keeps me a little bit more organized and I don't have to go to multiple places to do it. So I'm just going to stay within here from now on, but just keep in mind you can add new files and new folders from your File Explorer as well. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to click on the CSS folder. We're going to highlight that and we're going to click on new file. And that's going to open up a new file within the CSS folder. And we're just going to name that index.css and hit enter. And that's going to create a brand new CSS file for us. So that way all of our styles will go within this file here. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to the index.html file and we're going to link your new CSS file up with your HTML file. So that way when you add new styles to your CSS sheet, it will automatically apply to your HTML file. So all CSS files get linked within the head tag of the document. So we're just going to do this right below the title tag here. And we're going to open up a new tag. This tag is going to be a link tag. And we're going to do link and then rel equals, and this is going to be style sheet. So you're telling it what type of link it is. So we're doing a style sheet. And then the next attribute is the href, which is where is that file located. So for these, we're actually going to use what we call relative paths, which basically means a path that's relative to the current file that you're in. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a // which tells us that we're going to stay within the same folder that we're currently in. If we were to do // that means to go back one folder, but we want to stay within, because the index.html file is on the root of the folder, we want to stay within that same folder, which is our project. So we're going to do a // and then Visual Studio Code actually gives us options for what is currently in that directory. So we see that the CSS folder is there. So we're going to go ahead and just hit tab on it, which selects it, and that adds the CSS folder directory to our link. And then within the CSS folder, it tells us we have an index.css file. So I can just hit tab again, and that'll add the index.css to it. And that's all there is to it. And then link tags don't have a closing tag. They're self-closing, so that all we do is we do a / and then end the tag. And then that takes care of that. Now we're all linked up. So anytime we add a new style to our index.css file, that will apply directly to your HTML file, and the only thing you'll have to do when you're reviewing it is possibly just refresh your browser to see the changes. So now that we're all linked up, we need to go through and kind of reset some of the styles before we actually start applying our own styles to our HTML document. And by reset, what I mean is the browser by default likes to set certain styles on an HTML document without you doing anything. So let me show you what that is. So if I come over here to my browser, I can see that my first web page has some spacing up above and some spacing to the left. And I can actually visually show you that a little bit better by inspecting this document. And you can see that if I hover over the body, I've got margin that's set all the way around it. And that margin is set at 8 pixels. And that's done by the browser. That's not done by my CSS document. I have nothing in my CSS document right now. I have nothing in my HTML document that would tell it to do that. The browser just does it by default to kind of give you a little bit of spacing up front. The problem is when that's there, you're going to fight against that spacing the entire time that you're developing unless you reset those up front. And the same with like the H1 has some margin on the top and bottom of it. The paragraph tags do as well. Some of these we'll leave alone and will allow whatever is default to be there, but some of them we want to reset. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back over to our to our CSS page here that's already linked up, and we're going to do a first style, which is going to be an asterisk. And the asterisk is just basically a select all. So we're going to say for every single tag out there, it doesn't matter what it is on my HTML page, I want to set these styles up front. And so the main styles that I set up front are the padding, we bring to 0. The margin, we bring to 0. And I typically, because I don't use a lot of bulleted lists in my websites usually, I'll usually do the list style type as none, which gets rid of the bullet points on the unordered lists and the ordered lists. And then usually a font size I'll set. And I'll usually set to like 17 pixels to start with. And that's kind of my base font size. That's kind of what you'll see for like the paragraph text. And then we'll reset our heading font sizes and all that to kind of match our style. So those are usually kind of the 4 that I set up front. You can reset as many as you'd like. It depends on what the demands of your project are. So if there's quite a few more things that you'd like to reset up front because your project kind of demands it, go ahead and reset those there. It's not a big deal. All it's doing is it's setting that on every single element. It's setting these items. So now that we have that done, we save it. And if we come back to our website, you can see it got rid of all that spacing. Our heading is smaller. It's down to 17 pixels. We don't, and so is our paragraph here. So we don't have any of that margin and padding anymore that the browser was automatically setting because we reset those in the CSS file. So now that we've got that taken care of, we can start adding styles to our web page. So one thing I like to follow a lot, and this isn't necessarily a thing that you have to do, but it's something that I have learned to do over time because of the number of times I have overwritten my own styles, is I like to differentiate my web pages with an extra div tag around everything because I don't like to set styles on the body tag. And the reason for that is you might set a style on the body tag for your homepage that you don't need for, say, like your contact us page, and now you're fighting against your own styles the entire time where you're having to overwrite things and hopefully they take effect in the right order and all that. So instead what I like to do is I like to come right inside the body tag here and add a div, and I'll add this div all the way around all my content. So it's just inside the body tag, and I'll tab that in so that it all lines up nicely. And what I'll do here is I'll add an ID for the div that tells me what page I'm on. So usually I name it like, this is the home page, right? So I'll name it home page in camel case. And then I'll usually add some sort of class to it for the type of layout that I'm using. So I'll just call this main layout. And yes, before I go any further, you can add one ID and multiple classes to any sort of tag that you need to. I like to try to keep them as simple as possible if I can, but you can add multiple classes. And the way you do that is you actually just come inside this class tag, you add a space, and you can add a second class there, and that both those classes will take effect. But for the most part, I like to try to keep it to one class and a max of one class and one ID to any sort of tag, just to simplify things and keep my CSS from overwriting each other. And I'll show you what I mean about overwriting CSS in just a second. But this is how I like to do things. I like to give an ID, which is your unique identifier for the page, and then some sort of class that controls the layout. Because the classes I'll use over and over again, right? So I'll probably use a layout class multiple times across my website. I'm only going to use this ID one time across the entire website, just for this page, basically. So let's go ahead, and we're going to first, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of reset our H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6 tags. And the reason for that is we're going to make these kind of global, what we call global styles, which basically means any H1 across the website, any H2 across the website will have these styles, just so we can keep things consistent. So how we're going to do that is we're actually going to come back over here to our CSS folder, and we're going to actually add a new file. And this is going to be called, I'm going to call it shared.css. And the reason we do this with the global styles is any global style should have its own style sheet that can be linked to multiple web pages, because every single web page that you create, you're going to need to link style sheets to. And you get to tell it which style sheets, and it can be multiple style sheets as well, which ones should be linked and in what order. So we're going to we created this new shared.css, and that's where we're going to put our heading tag styles in, and then we're going to link that to our index.html file. So as I'm saying this, I'm realizing there's one thing that we need to change here, is the select all CSS styles should actually come over into our shared folder or file, because we're going to use this reset across every single file. So we're going to want that in the same, linked in the same file, so that way we don't have to keep typing that out for every single CSS document that we create. So I just went ahead and moved that over to our shared file here. And then we're going to go ahead and reset the H1 tag. So that'll be the first one that we kind of set up. Now, if we go over to this one resource that I reference quite a bit when I first started learning HTML, I still reference it today for different things, depending on what functionality I'm looking for, is W3 Schools. And they, for their heading file here, the H1 through H6 tags, they tell us what the default settings or values should be that the browser typically will set for each type of tag. So for the H1 here, it's saying that the font size should be 2EM. Now, if you've never seen the EM before, what that means is it's going to be a relative size to what the tag is currently set to in terms of the font size. So right now we have all of our font sizes set to 17 pixels, right? So what this means is 2EM is 2 times that relative font size. So when we put 2EM in, the browser is going to convert that to 34 pixels, because 2 times 17 is 34. And then the H2 down here is 1.5. So that's going to be 1.5 times 17, which would be 25.5 pixels for the H2. So we can either set pixel font sizes, or we can set EM font sizes based on that relative font size. I like to try to set pixel font sizes if I can, just because I like to be explicit with what I'm setting. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go back to our CSS document here, and we're just going to set the font size to 34 pixels for the H1. And then typically H1 tags have margin on the top and bottom to give themselves a little bit of extra space around elements. So let's go back to W3 schools here and see what that is. The margin top is 0.67 EM, which I'm not going to even attempt to do that math. So I'm just going to pull out the calculator and I'm going to do 17 times 0.67, which is 11.39. So I'll probably round up and I'll give it 12 pixels on the top and then 12 pixels on the bottom for margin. So let's go ahead and go back to here and we'll do margin. And because the top and the bottom are going to be the same and the left and right are going to be the same, I can actually set this all in one attribute here. As I can do margin and I can do 12 pixels, 0. And what that does is it tells me that the top and bottom are going to be set to 12 pixels and the left and right are going to be set to 0. And that's exactly what W3 schools is showing us here is the left and the right are 0, top and bottom are both 0.67. So we've got all that set there. Oh, and the font weight here is bold. But because we didn't reset the font weights in our select all attribute, we don't have to worry about resetting the font weight because it's already going to be set for us. It wasn't reset to a regular font weight. It remained bold. So that should stay. So let's go ahead and save this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come back over to the HTML document and we're going to link this right above our index.css style sheet. And the reason for this is because we want the shared CSS file to apply first. And then if we have anything in our index.css that contradicts that shared.css, the index.css is going to overwrite that style. So this is where that overwriting comes into play is when things are applied, they're applied in order, right? So you have your shared.css and then you have your index.css. So let's say we set up our H1 in here, right? We have everything set up with margin and font size. But let's say in the index.css, we reset that H1 and we give it like a font size of 40 pixels instead of 34 pixels. Well, that index.css is going to overwrite the original style that's set in the shared.css because it applies after the shared.css does. And this is going to be the fact for any sort of CSS throughout your entire website. If something doesn't look right, it's probably because something overwrote something else. So we're going to go back over to our web browser here and we're going to take a look, and you can see now our heading here is 34 pixels with 12 pixels on the top and the bottom for margin. And we can actually, if I inspect this, we can actually visually see that margin. If I open up, let's see here. There we go. And I highlight that H1, you can see in orange, that's the margin set on the top and the bottom, and both of those are set to 12 pixels. So we can see the shared CSS took effect. Now, let me show you, and I'll come back and we'll just put in our index.css, we'll put an H1 in here. And we'll say the font size is 18 pixels, something super small, right? Now, if we go back to our web page, you can see that updated, and it updated to 18 pixels because the index.css file is loaded in after the shared.css, which means any styles that contradict the shared.css file are going to overwrite and take effect from the index.css file. All right, so let's go ahead and set up at least the H2 and the H3s. I don't think we need to go past that for this example. So I'm just going to set up in our shared.css an H2. Then we're going to go back over to our W3 schools, and we have 1.5 EM for font size. So font size is going to be, I'm just going to call it 26 pixels. I don't like the half pixel stuff. You can set half, like decimal pixels. I just don't like doing it. if I can avoid it. So I just round up where I need to, or round down depending on what the situation is. And then the margin is 0.83 EM. So it's actually a larger margin than the H1, which is interesting. So we're going to go ahead and do 17 times 0.83, and that's 14.11. So I'll just keep it at 14 is what I'll do. So we're going to come over here and do 14 pixels, 0 again, because left and right are 0. And we're going to leave it as bold. And then we'll do the same thing for the H3. And we'll set up the font size, and that's going to be 1.17. Again, that math is not something I like to do, so 1.17, which is 19.89. So I'm just going to round up to 20 pixels for that. So let's go over here, 20 pixels. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet, and I should mention, is with CSS styles, at the end of every single style, you have to put a semicolon. If you don't, it will think that when it goes to read the CSS, the browser will think that, for instance, if I didn't have a semicolon here, it's going to think that the whole font size line is part of this list style type line, which it is not. So you have to make sure that you set the semicolon on the end of every single style, or else something like that will happen. And trust me, you'll make that mistake many, many times. I have throughout the years. But it'll be very obvious because all of a sudden your styles will just kind of disappear. A lot of them will. And you'll be like, why is that doing that? And you go back and look through the file and you'll find that you either missed a semicolon or you accidentally put a colon where a semicolon should be. Or you put a semicolon like here where a colon should be. So stuff like that happens, but just be aware of it, that you do need a semicolon on the end of every single line to terminate it. So that way it doesn't think that the next line is part of that previous line. So let's go ahead and look back at the margin top and bottom. Those are 1 EM. So that makes it super easy. We're just going to set the margin top and bottom at 17 pixels and 0, right? So we've got that set, and we can make sure left and right are 0. So that looks good. So that's our H1 through H3. So anytime we use the H1, H2, or H3 tags, these are the styles that are going to apply unless we overwrite them with our index.css file. So now that we've got that all set up, we're going to go ahead and move on to our actual web page and start putting some styles on the web page. So the first thing I like to do before we even get into building a header for this web page, which is the header is where you keep your your logo and any navigation buttons, usually is what you typically see on a website, is we're going to go ahead and set one style on the homepage ID. And the reason for this is I like to keep the text away from the edges of the web browser, especially for any one of the web pages. I like to keep a little bit of white space between the top and the bottom and the left and the right of the web browser, so it doesn't look like the text is smashing into the side or in the top or in the bottom. So what we'll do is we're going to target this homepage ID and we're going to add some padding around it. And the padding is going to push that text away from the edges a little bit. So let's go into our index.css because that's where we're going to apply our homepage styles. And an ID is denoted by the hashtag symbol, right? And then we're just going to do homepage. And we're going to open that up. And now for the homepage, we're going to set padding. And we're going to set padding of, let's do 15 pixels on the top and the bottom. And we're going to do 25 pixels on the left and the right. And that'll just keep everything away from the edges so it looks very clean and we don't run into any issues. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what that looks like on the browser. Here we go. And now you can see, we're going to go ahead and inspect this. If I highlight over the homepage div, you can see that padding in green. And you have the 15 pixels on the top and the bottom and the 25 pixels on the left and the right. So it keeps that text away from the edges. So that way you never run into it. So now that we've got that set, we can start building out our header a little bit. So we're going to go back over to our HTML file to do this. And we're going to keep the header outside of this homepage div because it's not really part of just the homepage. It's something that we'll be reusing across multiple pages. So we're going to set this inside the body but outside of that homepage div. And that way as well, the padding doesn't take effect for the header because we kind of want the header to push all the way to the edges of the browser window. So let's go ahead and set a header tag here. And that's another HTML tag that you can use, and this tells the browser that you're using a header. And then inside the header, we're going to set up a couple of divs. And the first div we're going to set up is we're going to give it a class of logo. And this is where our inside of where our logo is going to sit. For right now, since we don't have an image created or anything for our logo, we can just go ahead and put some text in there, and I'm just going to put my logo in for the text. Actually, we'll do my first web page as the text, and that'll be in the logo. And then we're going to come inside the header, but outside of that first div, we're going to make another div, and we're going to call this class equals navigation. And inside here is where our navigation HTML is going to sit. Now there is a tag for navigation that we're going to use. It's just called nav. And that lets the browser know that we're going to be setting up a navigation list. And for a navigation list, typically, the way we set these up is in an unordered list, so a UL tag. And then inside that UL tag, we have list items, which is LI tags. And the LI tags are where your navigation items are going to sit. So you might have home, you might have about, and we'll do one more of contact us. And we'll just set those as the 3 navigation items. Now we don't have any style set on this yet. So if we come back over to our web page, you can see everything is kind of just stacked on top of each other because that's what divs do. They're a block element, so they like to stack on top of each other. But we're going to change that, and we're going to get this to actually look like a header and get set up like a header with some styles. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to come into the shared.css because the header is going to be applied to multiple web pages at the same time. We're going to put this in the shared.css for now. We might change that later, but for now, that's where we're going to put it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to target the header tag. And this is a pretty unique tag, so we're not going to have any issues targeting this tag name inside the CSS file. So there's really no reason to add a class or an ID to it, just because it's a tag you're not going to use all over the place. So inside here, we're going to make sure, so we want the header to span the full width of the web browser on top, right? So we're going to make sure that happens, and we're going to set the width to 100%. And that's just going to ensure that we always take up 100% of the width of the web browser, regardless of what size the web browser is. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to set a specific height on this header. And you'll see this a lot throughout web development, but we typically like to set a specific height to the header because the height really should not change even with content changes inside the header. So we're going to set the height right now to 80 pixels. And that should give us sufficient room within the header. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set some padding on the left and the right hand sides because we don't want anything to be touching the very outside of the web browser. So we're going to set padding as 0 for the top and the bottom, and then we're going to set 15 pixels on the left and the right. And that should give us sufficient room on the left and the right so we're not running into things. Now, this is where it gets into some styles that we might not be used to yet and have not seen yet. And these are a little bit more advanced styles, but I feel like they're easy enough to understand up front, and then we can dive into them in later courses as well. The first one is we're going to set the display to flex. And Flexbox is a newer style in CSS3, but it allows us to align things a little easier and space things out a little easier than we would normally have to do with either inline blocks and margin and padding and all this other stuff. So what we're going to do with display flex is we're going to set an align items center. And what this does is because the display flex is set as a row going across, what align item center does is vertically it aligns everything into the middle of each other. So say your logo is a little bit bigger than your navigation text on the right hand side, it's going to set up the navigation text directly in the center of that logo vertically. So that way everything lines up real nice, it looks real nice, and you didn't have to do anything outside of one CSS property. The other thing we're going to set is the justify content, and we're going to say space between. And what this does is it's going to push, because we have two items in the header, it's going to push the logo as far left as it can, and it's going to push the navigation items as far right as it can. So that way we get the navigation items over on the right hand side where they should be, and the logo on the left hand side where it should be. And any space in between is kind of dead space, and Flexbox takes care of that space. So we don't have to. We don't have to calculate it. We don't have to do anything. So those are those properties that we're going to set. And we're just going to take a look now at the web page. And now you can see up top here, you've got your logo on the left-hand side and your navigation items way over here on the right-hand side. Now we still have to deal with lining these navigation items up. We haven't done that yet, and we will here in a second. And we're just going to take a look at that. Yeah, that all looks good. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to our styles and we're going to look at our HTML, see what we have next to do. I'm not going to mess with the logo right now because I don't think we really need to in this stage, but we're going to play with this navigation, and we're going to show you how to target all the way down this list to make sure we're targeting the right things. So, we're going to go back to our shared and we're going to create a new line. And this is going to be header space period for class navigation, and then space UL, which is the unordered list tag, which is the next level down in that HTML. And we're going to style this. And for the unordered list, what we're going to do is we're going to do something similar we did with the header, and we're going to do display flex. We're going to align items center. In the justify content, we're actually going to do what's called flex end, which basically means it's going to align everything to the far right hand side where it can. Now the next thing we're going to add here, and this is different than the header, is we're going to add the gap. And we're going to add a gap of 8 pixels for right now. And what that does is between every single child element of the unordered list, so every single list item, it's going to automatically put 8 pixels of spacing between each item. So that way we don't have to worry about adding margin or padding to those list items. Flexbox will automatically take care of it, and it'll take care of it only in between those child elements. So we can go ahead and take a look here, and over on the right hand side you can see there's this little bit of space in between each one of those. You can see that here with the purple color. You can see the 8 pixels of space in between each list item element, and they're all lined up on the center of each other, so that way everything lines up real nice and looks nice. So you'll notice though, for some reason we're coming off the edge of this screen, right? And you're having to scroll over to see everything. And there's actually another property we need to add to the header, and that is called box sizing. And the value we're going to give it is border box. And what this does is, so what padding does by default with CSS is you have your container size, and if you add padding to it, it actually expands the width and height of that container by the amount of padding you added. So if we had 100% width on our container, and then we add 15 pixels on the left and the right, it's actually adding an extra 30 pixels of width to that 100%. So we're actually outside of the view of the edge of the web browser, so it creates a scroll bar for it. What box sizing border box does is it pulls those back in. So that way your width is still 100% and the padding has to take up space within that 100%. So we can see that now if we come back over, we don't have a scroll anymore, right? You can see there's still padding over here on the right hand side of 15 pixels, but the contact us isn't going off the edge of the screen anymore, and that's because of that box sizing border box. So next, I like to have my navigation items just slightly larger than my regular text. So we're going to target that next. So we're going to do header space period navigation, which is our class navigation, and then the unordered list, and then the list items. So this will target all list items within that unordered list that's within the navigation class, which is within the header tag. So we're getting very specific here, right? So that way we're not applying these styles outside of the header element. So we're just going to set the font size of 18 pixels. And another fun CSS property that you can do is you can actually set the text to all uppercase. So we're going to do that next, and we're going to do text transform uppercase. And no matter how you have your text set in your HTML document, now all the font within those list items will be all uppercase, and we can see that here in the HTML document. So now you can see everything's uppercase. It looks good. Now what we probably want to do is we probably want to set like a background color on the header just to differentiate. So there's two different ways you can do this, and you can decide which way you want to do this, but I'm going to show you both. So the first one is going to be, we're going to set the background color of the header. So that way you can see a clear difference between what the header is and what the rest of the website is. So we're going to come back through the header item here in our CSS, and we're just going to do a background color, and I'm just going to set it to I'm going to set it to a blue that I know the value of. So what this value here for color is, this is called a hex value. And every single color, web safe color, has a hex value. And it's kind of hard to explain in terms of what those values actually mean, but it's similar to if you know what the RGB values are, the red, green, blue values for color are. It's similar to that. It's setting essentially 2 characters per channel to create that color. So I typically use these hex values. I'll look them up if I need to. I know this one off the top of my head, so I know that. Like, for instance, white is pound FFF, and then black is pound 0000000. You'll understand and you'll start memorizing a lot of those as the more you use different colors. But if you need to look up a value, just go ahead and come to your web browser and just Google it. So say you want like a, I don't know, crimson red hex code. It's going to give you a crimson red hex code. It's also going to give you the RGB values for it, as well as the CMYK, which really isn't as, you don't really need the CMYK for web, because CMYK is really meant for print. Those 4 values control print colors, as the RGB values control web colors, as well as the hex code. So you can look up any hex code you need to. You can play around with that. There's one website that I would suggest if you want to explore colors and different colors and what colors complement each other. It's called Adobe Color Wheel, or Adobe color.adobe.com. And you can go here and you can set any value you want to in the center. item, and it'll give you complementing colors. So if I do the 38B6FF, and then I set my color harmony to complementary, it's going to give me complementary colors based on that color that I selected. And you can play with this wheel, you can turn it, you can do whatever you want with it, and it'll give you all the complementary colors across the board, which is great. So I would suggest using that. I use it a lot for when I'm stuck with what other color should I use on my website. I come to Adobe Color and play with the color wheel. So now I've got my background color set. That's the first way you can kind of differentiate a header. The other thing you can do is you can actually set a box shadow on the very bottom here. And what the box shadow is going to do is it's kind of make it look almost three-dimensional and give you a little bit of more visual spacing between the header and the rest of it. So let's set up the box shadow real quick. We're just going to come down here and do box hyphen shadow. And we're going to set the 0 for the first value, 3 pixels for the second, 6 pixels for the third, and then the color is the very last thing. And this is where I'll get into what's called RGBA, which is red, green, blue, and alpha. Alpha is opacity. So this is where I don't want like a pure black, but I want something that's black but toned down, is more opaque. So I'll do 0, 0, 0 for black, and then the very last value I'll put at like 0.25, which means 25% opacity. And then when we save that and come here, now you can see right here on the bottom, you can see this little bit of shadow. It makes the header look like it's three-dimensional and kind of floating on the page. So that's the second way you can kind of differentiate your header from the rest of the web page. And sometimes I use both. Like right now, I'll probably leave both of these on here because I think that looks a little bit better than just having one. But if you say you needed a white header and the rest of your page is white, I'll take out my background color for a second, and we'll save that and come back. You can see this box shadow really helps distinguish what is header and what is the rest of the web page. And that's going to do it for our Intro to Web Development course. I hope you had a great time learning all about CSS and HTML and a little bit of history about the web. And I encourage you to continue to explore those items and get yourself more used to building out simple websites and styling them and how you want to see them styled. In our next course, we're going to dive back into strictly HTML and really get a good understanding of what all the tags do and how they should be used. And I hope to see you there.